Welcome to The Book of Life, a show about Jewish books, music, film, and web. I'm Heidi Estrin. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries. The Book of Life's Canadian correspondent, Anne Dublin, spoke with Sharon McKay, author of a number of books for youth about the Holocaust. Her most recent title is Enemy Territory, which won the 2013 Canadian Jewish Book Award. Let's listen in to Anne's and Sharon's conversation.
Montreal-born author Sharon McKay is well known for her novels for young adults. Her most recent works include War Brothers, a novel about child soldiers in Uganda, and Thunder over Kandahar, the story of two girls making their way across Afghanistan. With Kathy Kaser, Sharon also wrote a series of Holocaust stories, Whispers from the Ghettos, Whispers from the Camps, and Whispers from Hiding. Along the way, Sharon has won or been shortlisted for many awards in Canada and abroad. They include the Governor-General's Award for Charlie Wilcox and the Violet Downey IODE Award for War Brothers. Sharon's latest book is a novel for young people called Enemy Territory. In early July, I interviewed Sharon via Skype at her home near Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island. I'm going to start by asking you the question I ask every author. What were you like as a young reader?
I didn't read until late for most people, so I didn't really start reading until grade 3 or 4. And I was a voracious reader of classic comics. They were still 12 cents, so for a quarter I could get a comic book, a Coca-Cola for 5 cents, and the rest of the money would go on bubblegum every Saturday morning. In the summers, we lived in a great big old cottage up in Lake McDonald in the Laurentians, and that's where I found Enid Blyton. Like most kids, at least back then, I think, I loved stories where there were no adults in them. If there was an adult in the story, I didn't like the story. I liked it where there was absolutely no adults. It was all kid-driven, and any story like that was fine. I liked Nancy Drew to a certain extent. And then until I discovered, like most kids, hey, they're all the same. Well, I encourage kids to read any books that they want, vampire books or what have you. That lesson, that moment of, oh my gosh, this is terrible, is a really valuable lesson.
Yeah, and we always say that in children's literature, the kids are the ones who should solve the problems. So, of course, it's kid-driven.
Absolutely. And even the adults in classic comics, I didn't mind. I guess I just appreciated them as stories. And a lot of our classic comics, some of them would be tough. I remember reading The Call of the Wild. I did all of Dickens. And these were stories about adults. And yet I didn't mind. Didn't mind at all. Didn't care.
So, Sharon, when did you start writing?
It was always in the plans, but I wrote nonfiction until I was, I guess about 35. So I wrote Chalk Around the Block, all those books for Somerville House. We think that sidewalk chalk has been around forever. Well, it hasn't been. I walked into Jane Somerville's office with 3 sticks of chalk in an elastic band and said, I want to make chalk this big. We couldn't find any place to make it anywhere in the world. I think Jane eventually found a place in France. And I think Chalk Around the Block, which came with, it's a book and a thing, so it came with all the games of chalk games, and then it came with 4 thick, colorful pieces of chalk. I think Crayola picked that up within a couple of months. And we have what we have today. I mean, sidewalk chalk is everywhere.
That's right. Yeah. So you were a pioneer.
It was just so much fun in those days to do all those books and things. I liked the design of them. I liked the creativity of them. I liked how you had to sort of stand on your head and think about not only the book itself, but about how the product itself sits on a store shelf? Is it too big? Is it too small? Will it tip over? You know, there's some that Somerville House did really, really well. They did a skeleton book, but it was so tall and so big, bookstores didn't want to carry more than 3 or 4. So, I mean, there was a lot of learning going on, and it was a good time. It was a fun time.
And it made you aware, I'm sure, about marketing, right? I mean, writing is not just writing books. It's the final product. What happens when it gets out there in the world? Those are big questions.
I was with Somerville House for quite a long time. And I was an acquisitions editor there, too. And I found that Jane Somerville very creative, incredibly creative. The company's gone now, and, of course, no one's replaced it. Klutz in the States, of course, does the books and things, but we've never had that Canadian bent again. It's gone, and I don't think it's coming back.
So, Sharon, let's move to your fiction. You've written about some very tough subjects. You've traveled to Afghanistan as the Canadian Forces official war artist. When things are hard, you know, either the writing part of it or just emotionally, like traveling and dealing with these tough subjects, where do you get support? Where do you rejuvenate yourself? How do you do it?
Oh, I don't think I do. I don't think there's time for that. Usually I'm on a contract. I've got a deadline. When I went to northern Uganda, Joseph Kony was still running around there at the time. I arrived in Kampala and then got on a small plane for Gulu in the absolute hope and trust that the story that I wanted was actually waiting for me at the airport, you know, kind of like standing there. And it was. I arrive places and stand there and go, okay, now what? And so far, that hasn't failed me. The topics are getting tougher. War Brothers was hard. Working on child soldiers every day was really, really hard. Seeing it actually, the novel, I think writing the novel was easier than writing the bubbles for the graphic novel. Now, you know, mind you, I have to give full credit there to Dan LaFrance, the artist, who really carried me through that book, you know, in terms of my learning curve. And now that's not to say the story's mine, all the bubbles are mine, all of that. But in terms of learning a new way of looking at a story. But, you know, I'd already been through that process before when I did books and things at Somerville House, when I learned about how to write a book with a product, how the product functioned, whatever. Well, you know, years later then I'm working on a graphic novel, and I'm learning about, you know, what is conveyed by the picture and what's conveyed by the dialogue. Don't repeat. How do the characters, how do they move on the page? The graphic novel is the ultimate don't tell show, words to live by. So that was a huge learning curve I had to go through. And in that process of writing that book, I also moved across the country, sold a house, bought a house, sold a car, bought a car, all those things that we went from a great big old rambling log house that I loved to a much smaller, although more rooms, but much smaller house in Prince Edward Island, so there was downscale. All these things were going on, editing my life, changing my life, and writing this graphic novel. I was in hotel rooms working on this. I was sitting in airports working on this. And the plus side was it was extremely distracting from, you know, my life, which was a mess at the time. And, you know, just finding things, you know, when you move house, like try and find your underwear. But through that whole process, there was this graphic novel. There was child soldiers. There was violence. It was a wonderfully hard experience, and I'm grateful for it.
But you made it through. I mean, that's something that a lot of people forget, that as writers, we still have to live our lives, and we still have our own personal challenges aside from the whole writing life.
There's more graphic novels coming. I mean, that's I didn't get to go through all that without making some sort of, you know, career moves as well. But I write visually, so it's not hard to find somebody who can see can see the graphic novel in it. I always have artists calling and wondering if they could take a book and do it. It's not as easy as that, but it's also a style that I'm continuing to work on, that visual style.
I'd like to talk about Enemy Territory. It won the Canadian Jewish Book Award for Children's Literature recently. I've read it. I was completely engrossed in it. It was a real page-turner and troubling. Enemy Territory tells the story of two boys, Yusuf, a Palestinian, and Sam, an Israeli. They find themselves uneasy roommates in the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem. One night, the boys slip away and go on an adventure, physically and emotionally, through the old city and near the Dead Sea. So, Sharon, tell us why you wrote Enemy Territory.
I thought I could. It's not one of my favorite books, to be honest. It was a lot thicker at one point. I redid, I rewrote, I redid. At the time, I had been with the Christian-Jewish Dialogue for 18 years. I'm not Jewish. Not particularly Christian, but never mind that. And although I am an Anglican, I had been placing Holocaust survivors in churches for that entire time, which is what that committee did. I had written 3 books, Holocaust books, with Kathy Kaser, who is known for her writing on Holocaust stories, and she herself is a child of survivors. What else? I had taken the courses for years at the Yad Vashem in Israel on the Holocaust. I'm certainly comfortable teaching it and talking about it, but more specifically about the ghettos than I am the camps. I certainly had an affinity for that part of history and that time in history. And Rick Wilkes is the publisher of Anik Press. He showed a lot of confidence, which gave me a lot of confidence. My editor was Barbara Burson. So between all of those things, when we all actually sat down and said, is this doable? I think one of my biggest fears was that phrases would be pulled out of context. And if that happens, I'm surprised it hasn't. If that does happen, that's when it all falls apart. Because both boys hurl abuse at each other. And the other difficult thing with this is to keep that abuse age appropriate. Someone who is Palestinian, and this has happened, a Palestinian has read it and said, this is biased towards Israel. I have heard members of the Canadian Jewish community say this is biased to the Palestinians. So whatever you bring to it is what's going to happen. We balanced it as best we could, back and forth, back and forth. There are a lot of things left out. Again, that a lot of that was cut out and edited. A lot of history was left out because one always has to keep in mind, what does a 12-year-old actually know? And both sides have laundry lists, past hurts, past abuses, past murders, past attacks, both sides, over and over. He did this, no, he did this. He did this, no, he did that. I mean, it goes back and forth. We had to remember and keep up front that, in fact, it was 12-year-olds would not know all of this history. People will say, oh, yes, they do. They're taught it. Well, no. It's like saying to a Canadian 12-year-old, name all the prime ministers of Canada. That's not going to happen.
That's right.
Maybe they are taught it, but they don't know it. Sorry. So that was the issues were huge. It was read by rabbis who did not want their names used because they thought it would be provocative. But yes, they said, yes, all of this is right. It was read by Palestinians who did not want their names. I mean, it got to the point where I could have thrown myself under a truck. Oh. Would I do it again? No. Never. It was too hard. It was just too simply hard to try and keep that balance going back and forth and back and forth. And, of course, in all this political stuff, there has to be a story of boys you actually like or don't like, or, that sort of emotional tie-in. That was really hard. I have issues with it. I have problems with it. And I probably will forever. I know what's missing. I know what I would do again differently. But I'm not touching it again. Frankly, I think it's a play more than it's a book, because that would bring on the nuances, the body language and whatever.
Well,
and the dialogue's vicious.
I mean, there's a lot of dialogue. And it's an adventure story, too. You're a wonderful writer of action and of dialogue, and it really comes across.
I was in all those places.
Yeah.
I was in the West Bank, liked it. I had a good time, drank beer. I felt perfectly safe. I ended up on mountaintops at midnight. I drove all over the place. I didn't have any problems. And I had girlfriends in Jerusalem, Israeli friends, who were petrified for me. I mean, they were beyond nervous. Keep in mind that Israelis are not allowed to go into the West Bank for perfectly good reasons. So, Israelis may live side by side, but they don't actually have any experience of having been across a border that can be a kilometer away.
Well, it's a physical border, but it's also an emotional border, a spiritual border. The borders are high and wide and deep.
There's legalities to that, too, right? There's simply a law.
That's right.
And unless you're prepared to break the law, and who is?
So, Sharon, let's move on to a couple other questions. What are you working on now?
It's a big project. There's several big projects. One is another graphic novel. That'll be for Anik. There's a project with Amnesty International that will be horrible and difficult, and probably that this will be in some ways the last big hard project I'm taking on. It's not that I see retirement as a possibility. I do have a limit. I realized I was in Afghanistan last month, and I do realize the physicality of it is getting harder for the hard travel. And just that kind of reality of saying, for God's sake, Sharon, you live in PEI. What are you doing? Yeah. So there's that. I may just find a time when that kind of travel is done. And since I believe that you can't write properly without going there, that will change the types of stories that I do. And I have some other stories that, I've been meaning to get to. So I have a long and deep history with conflict in different areas of the world. It was either Afghanistan twice, Uganda, West Bank, Northern Ireland. And looking ahead, some of the places that I do have on my list, I have to get to them fairly soon because I just don't see a 70-year-old sort of peddling around.
Is there any question you wished I'd asked you and didn't?
I write outside my culture. In my mind, I'm not writing about war. I'm writing about relationships with perhaps a backdrop of conflict. So to me, it's about friendship. It's about my main themes have never ever changed. The themes are loyalty. It's what I care about the most is loyalty. Not mindless loyalty, not stupid loyalty, but loyalty. And I would attach that to friendship. And how that is tested depends on where they are in the world. And does it come first or does it come second? In enemy territory, just at the end, Sam, who is the Israeli, at the very end, he puts down his cards and he puts loyalty first when he says, my friend must have his operation. That's the most important thing. So in that one sentence is the statement that to him, what now comes first is his friend. And that's it. So it all came down to one little sentence.
I love reading your book. May you continue to tell these difficult stories as long as you want with your typical insight and compassion. For more information about Sharon McKay and her books, you can go to her website at www.sharonmckay.ca. This is Anne Dublin signing off in Toronto. Thank you, Sharon.
Thanks, Anne.
There are so many ways to connect with the Book of Life. Fan us at facebook.com/bookoflifepodcast. Follow us at twitter.com/bookoflifepod. Email us at bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 561-206-2473. You can also listen to the latest episode by phone at 916-313-3820. And of course, find links to everything at bookoflifepodcast.com. The Book of Life is a podcast service of the Feldman Library at Congregation B'nai Israel in Boca Raton, Florida at cbiboca.org and is supported in part by the Association of Jewish Libraries at jewishlibraries.org. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band at freilachmakers.com. Thanks for listening and happy reading.